Today on Practical Church Planting, we're talking about the different times that you can do announcements during your service.
Welcome back, everybody, to Practical Church Planting, where in 15 minutes or less, we'll give you practical tips, advice, and encouragement to help you and everybody else plant and grow healthy churches. My name is Brian Josie, and joining me is Dylan Dodson, and today we're talking about announcement placement in your services.
Yeah, so we're going to give you 4 of the most popular times in your service of when you could do announcements, or as New City Church, we don't like to call them announcements because no one likes that. We call them next steps, but for this purposes, so everyone's on the same page, announcements. We're not necessarily going to recommend or tell you the best, but just some pros and cons, and you can maybe think more intentionally about when you give your announcements in your service.
Perfect.
So here are the 4, the most popular ones. Number 1 is when to literally start your service off with announcements.
Sure.
The second most, or not second most popular one, but the next place you could do it is maybe between songs, maybe between your first song, your second song, however many songs you do, but somewhere in between that.
Yep.
Third is starting your message off with announcements. So before the sermon starts, you have someone or you giving the announcements. And fourth is at the end of your service.
Right.
So we have some opinions on which ones might be better or worse, but just kind of pros and cons to help you think through where am I doing this to be more intentional so that you can have the best service possible.
And fifth is not doing them at all, which
actually is kind of great. But yeah, if you're going to do them, which most of us do them, we're going to do them. So let's talk about the first one, the start of your service.
Beginning of service.
Here's some pros and cons of it. Some of the pros are, or some of the cons, are you might say, well, if I start the service, people will miss it because people are still walking in when the service starts.
Nobody's on time.
People don't come on time. It normally takes 5 or 10 minutes for everyone to get in there. And so that can be a con, right? Is that you can start your service and nobody hears them. But at the same time, Brian, that can also be a pro.
Right.
Why? Because nobody really likes announcements. And here's the deal. If you're going to have somebody miss something in your service, what would you rather it be? Would you rather it be some of the worship songs, some of the message, or the announcements? What is the most popular thing? Not that you don't want people to know what's going on, but if they're going to miss something, would you rather them miss a song or would you rather them miss the announcements?
Right. And I think with this one, if you want to do it at the beginning of service, it kind of depends on what your announcements are.
Yep.
If it's something very important, like, hey, we're moving to 2 services and we need to make sure people know the service times versus there's this thing that not really applies to everybody, then that you can kind of gauge whether it's okay if some people miss it. If it's kind of
that's a good point.
I kind of see the beginning as kind of the throwaway time. If you put it at the beginning, it's kind of the throwaway to get some people, give some people time to get in.
Right. So other than big deal announcements, just the typical things, the pro is that people are gonna miss something in your service. So if the announcements are the least important,
right.
And then the con is that they will miss them if you start your service. The nice thing is, though, sometimes when you hear people talking, at least people might start coming in. But that's the pro and con of doing it at the beginning of your service.
Yeah, and I mean, one thing about it is, like you said, more people are going to miss it if it's at the beginning. And it's kind of okay to try and manufacture that energy doing announcements or next steps versus starting a song off with very little people in the room or starting the song off with very little energy. So I can see that being a pro of doing it there so you don't have to start worship on low energy.
Right. So that's one. The next popular place is in between songs. Now, the pro of doing it after the first or second song, however many songs that you typically do before your message, is that by now, most of the people will probably hear it.
People are in.
So that is a con. That is a pro. More people will hear what you're actually talking about. The con of doing it in between songs is that it can break up the flow and the maybe the energy and the kind of the emotion of the moment because you have to stop, have people sit down, and listen to your announcements.
Yep, that's the tough one. I think that's a good place to do it, and we do it there. We do it at that place at sometimes, but it is tough because it completely breaks up worship, and you can't really carry that energy from one song into the next, or carry that momentum or the feeling in the room from one song to the next.
Now, that being said, episode 27, we talk about 4 tips for better announcements.
Yep.
Especially when you do it in between songs, it does matter how you do them.
Yes.
So if you're going to do them in between songs, you don't want to bore people. I would listen to that episode 27, and apply some of those things. Because if you're going to break up the worship set, at least you want to try to kind of keep things moving instead of putting people to sleep and then having them stand back up and sing.
Yeah, and one thing I'd say is if you do it there, unless they're incredibly quick, you're going to have people sit and stand back up. So it needs to be obviously concise and quick, but also long enough and engaging enough to make it worth someone sitting down and standing back up. You'd hate to have people sit down for 20 seconds, and then get back right up. Now, and it's like, what was the point?
I would be shocked if you were able to do that because most people kind of err on the side of way too long.
True.
But if you only have 1 or 2 things to say, like you were saying, that kind of does determine where you should do it.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of factors in it too. If you have not a lot to say, then maybe you don't seat them, or maybe you have enough, but that's another time in between songs.
Right.
Pro, everybody hears it. Con, it can mess up the kind of the flow a little bit. A third popular place to do it is at the beginning of the message. Now, I will just go ahead and tell you, of the 4 most popular times, this is the worst.
Now, are you saying beginning of the message as in the pastor at the beginning of the message, or someone else come up before the message?
How I often see it done is the pastor at the beginning of the message. Now, you could do the announcements after the song, before a bumper video, and that's fine too. But a lot of people do it where the pastor will get up. Before you get in the message, you start giving people announcements.
Yeah.
And that is just don't.
Right.
Don't. And I get it, because maybe the pastor knows what's going on, especially in a smaller, newer church plant, and so they want to be able to explain things well. But we've talked about this in our preaching, some of our preaching episodes and that sort of thing, that the beginning of your message is the most important time.
Right.
You shouldn't welcome people. You shouldn't thank them for being there. You should not talk about announcements, because it's the only time in your message where everybody's listening. So you want to engage them and pull them in, not put them to sleep. And I know it's easy, but the pro of this one is just there is not one.
Right.
I just wouldn't do it at this time.
Right. My feeling, this might be, kind of a hot take, I don't know, but from the beginning of the message itself to the end of the message, just leave announcements out of it. Like, have the message be the message, and figure out another place to put them.
Right. Now, as a side note, if you have something coming up, maybe you have a big small group or community group push or something you want people to know about.
If it's applicable.
If you can preach into your sermon, you don't want to give announcements, but that's kind of a different thing for another episode.
Yeah.
But preaching announcements in your sermon is helpful. We're just talking about the general announcement thing. I know it's easy and people are sitting down and it doesn't break up the flow, and it is the worst time to do them.
Yeah.
I would not do them at the beginning of your service. And if that's what you currently do, any other time is better. And so I would just try something else. I know it seems like everyone's sitting down and listening. I don't want to break up the flow. I don't want to start at the beginning of the service. I don't want people to miss it. And so everyone's just don't.
Yeah, and you did mention, the other option sort of is right after worship, right before, if you do a bumper video, right before the message with another person coming up and doing it. Well, I'd say that's better. I still would say that that's probably the worst of all of them that we're going to give, because worship, as it ends, will end on some sort of energy or some sort of, feeling in the room. And then to kind of, I hate to say it, but kind of kill that with someone getting up and giving announcements, and then having the preacher get up after that,
right,
and having to kind of flow off of the feeling of announcements, I think makes it a lot tougher. And
you might be saying, well, what if someone else gives the announcements and then the preaching starts? You still have the same dynamic of people are sitting down and they're listening. Everybody's listening at once, and you can waste it. Doesn't matter if it's the preacher or someone else, and then the preacher comes up. You're still wasting that initial time where everyone's paying attention. So I would not do it there.
Yep.
And then another popular one is at the end of your service.
Right.
Now, at New City Church, we have done beginning, between songs, and the end.
Yep.
We've never done number 3, because that's just, don't do number 3. The end of service. Now, here's the pro of that. Again, most people are there, and they're listening. And so, again, they're not going to miss out on what you're going to say. So that's another pro of doing it at the end. The con of doing it at the end, and why we would recommend not... Actually, I take that back. I don't think we've done them at the end.
Not full announcements. Sometimes we'll throw like one applicable.
That's right. Because I was like, wait. I also would not recommend at the end. And here's the con, because what you leave people with is what they remember the most.
Yeah.
And so if you're leaving people with announcements, especially if you're going on and on about these different things, the more you say at the end, the more they're going to forget what the message is about. It's a different, like at New City, we often do a song and then I'll come up and end, or someone will come up and end in like a 30-second, thanks for being here if you're new, and maybe say one announcement if it's applicable, like that right away. But 30 seconds or less, because as you're talking and talking, that's what people are going to leave with. And then we also, before we send them out, if we do an announcement, we'll say the bottom line again. So that's the last thing they walk out with. But the end of the service, I know it's kind of easy. You don't break up the flow at all. So that's the pro of it. It's like the worship isn't messed up. You don't bore people with announcements before the sermon. The service is over, so there's no flow breakup at all. But it's what people are going to leave with is remembering the announcements. And especially if they're long and boring, they're going to leave feeling a little bored.
Yeah, I'd say the only reason you should do any sort of announcement type thing at the end of service is if there's something that they need to know about, like right then, like there's something going on right after service, or there's something that today's the last day to sign up, and even though you mentioned it in your announcements at the beginning of service, they would have forgotten by now. But I'm glad you said it. One thing that we do is, we have to throw those in from time to time, but then after that, we repeat the bottom line, because at the end of the day, that's more important than anything else. So we don't want that to kind of fall out of their head so they remember about this sign up. We want that to be what they remember, and then hopefully they kind of remember what's going on.
Yes. And the thing about announcements too is we put way more into them than what we should. Like we think if we say an announcement, that's what everyone will know what's going on. but they're actually not that effective. And so I think that's part of why we say so much and we talk so much, is because we want to tell everyone information, but they're not really going to remember it.
Yeah.
And so again, I would go to episode 27. Pretty sure that's what it is. 4 tips for better announcements. We talk about more how to give good ones, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend ending at the end of service, because that's what people are going to leave with.
Yep.
So at New City Church, here's what we do. We go back and forth currently between starting our service with Next Steps or after the first song. Now, if we also go back and forth between doing someone on stage and also doing videos. We try to do videos more if we can, because that's more engaging and we can make them what we want them. They're also often a little bit funnier. So if you do video announcements, I wouldn't recommend starting your service with a video announcement, because people don't know the service is starting. Like if you start with music playing, they walk in. Or if you start with someone talking, something's going on, I should come in there. Oftentimes when we start with a video, especially if you have pre-service music, nobody really knows that maybe it's a countdown video. So if you do a video announcement, I wouldn't recommend starting your service with it. But currently what we do the most of is after the first song. So it does break up the flow a little bit, but if you do them well and you don't have to be boring, then that can continue the momentum on a little bit. And we also don't go 5 or 10 minutes with announcements too. We try to make them quick.
And one thing I'll add, if you've already planted and you're kind of getting established, this might not be as applicable to you, but if you're in the process of figuring out your church plant and haven't taken that step yet and kind of figuring out what your whole service is going to look like, one thing to decide before deciding where Next Steps goes is how you're going to do offering, because there are churches that still pass a plate or still pass a bucket. And so that's kind of, always kind of goes hand in hand with when you do announcements. So that's something maybe you want to figure that out first. So then that's kind of, if that's the route you decide to go, which I don't think we can really, not really right or wrong, just if that's the route you decide to go, then that'll kind of dictate where your next steps or your announcements go.
And I would honestly say, that being said, because at New City we don't pass the offering plate.
Right.
I still think a lot of these things still apply. But if you do pass the plate, probably starting the service with it. Yeah. I wouldn't do announcements and passing the plate 2 different times. I would probably do it all together, because you can do announcements while you're passing the plate and that sort of thing. So you couldn't start the service that way.
Yes.
But I still wouldn't do it before the message. Never do it before the message.
Also wouldn't do it at the end of the message. So pretty much if you're doing that, then do it in between songs.
Yeah, you could do it in between, or you could do it at the very end of the service. Not at the end of the message, at the service, or however you do that. But but for us, we do beginning of the service, and we also try to do more in the middle, especially if we can do videos. What we've just found, and this is just our experience, is that when we start the service with a song, it gets people in there and it creates more energy, even if not everyone's in there right away. When we found, when we start with Next Steps, even if they're funnier, unless they're actually really funny and engaging, the service kind of starts off feeling a little bleh.
Yeah, to me, when it starts off with Next Steps, the next steps feel kind of throwaway. But however, when we start with the song never really feels throwaway to me. Even if there's less people in the room, it still feels like it's worth doing. Where sometimes, and I've done it myself, we get up to do announcements where people are still filtering in. It's like, is it even really worth doing right now? Yeah.
And it can feel a little awkward, especially if you're a newer church or a smaller church and you're talking about the Connect card, or you're saying something about, if you're new for the first time, how you can get more connected, and then there's nobody in there.
Right.
But yeah, and as a side note, I would just say this as well too. Not only does it matter where you do your announcements, but we would also recommend, for us, we don't always do announcements, or have a lot of them, but we always talk about if you're new. And so you do want to, even if you don't have a lot of announcements, I would every single week make a point somewhere where people normally do announcements, if you don't have a lot of them, where you're talking about if it's your first time. Not asking people to stand up or raise their hand or anything, just saying if you have a Connect card. Because if you don't address that there are new people will stop coming. And even if you're like, well, there are no new people, you got to do it every week so that everybody knows, if I bring a friend, they will be accepted and they will be recognized. And then we don't assume that there's no new people here. So you do want to throw that in there somewhere.
Yes, people need to know that you're expecting new people and prepared for them, not that if they bring a friend that they'll be the only new person that's ever showed.
Yep. So those are some thoughts about when to do it for your services, when to do announcements, or when to do Next Steps. Thanks for being with us. If you have questions about church planning or ministry that you want us to answer in a future episode, practicalplanning.com/questions. Thanks for listening, and we'll be with you next time on Practical Church Planning. Thanks so much for watching this episode of Practical Church Planning. Whether you're watching on Facebook or YouTube or Practical Planning, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, make sure you like or subscribe or do whatever it's telling you to do or should do on that platform.
And hey, if you are so tired of looking at our ugly faces, but you're not tired of listening to our beautiful voices, then you can find our podcast if you just search Practical Church Planning on iTunes or Google Play. Make sure not to just find it, not just to listen, but to subscribe.
Make sure you subscribe. Brian, tell them to subscribe.
Subscribe.
See you next time.